January 17th, 1945. Luzon, Philippine Islands. 0547 hours. The earth still trembled. Dust hung in the air like a funeral shroud, thick enough to choke on, gray and acrid with the smell of cordite and something worse. The sweet, nauseating rot of flesh baking under tropical sun. The jungle had been silenced. No birds called from the canopy. No insects hummed their eternal song. Only the settling debris spoke, whispering as it cascaded down the collapsed hillside where, 72 hours earlier, an entire American field hospital had stood. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Army's 105th Division lowered his field glasses with trembling hands. His unit had waited 3 days to approach this sector, knowing full well what their artillery barrage had accomplished. The coordinates had been precise. The bombardment had been thorough. 88 shells, each weighing 45 kilograms, had been launched in a concentrated pattern designed not merely to destroy but to obliterate. The orders had been explicit: eliminate the American medical facility before the main assault. Remove their capacity to heal. Break their will by burying their wounded alive. Yamamoto had expected silence. He had expected graves. What he witnessed instead would fracture something fundamental in his understanding of warfare, of America, and of the men he had been taught to despise as soft, as weak, as spiritually inferior. From the rubble, from beneath tons of shattered bamboo, collapsed timber, surgical equipment twisted into abstract sculpture by high explosives, something moved. A hand emerged first, then an arm, then a figure pulling itself upward through the debris with methodical, impossible determination. The man was caked in gray dust so thick he appeared carved from stone, a golem rising from the earth itself. His medical insignia, the Red Cross on a white circle, was barely visible beneath layers of dried blood that was not his own. He carried no weapon. His right leg dragged behind him at an unnatural angle. But he was walking, and in his arms, he carried a wounded Filipino civilian, a young girl no more than 7 years old, her face peaceful and unconsciousness against his chest. Yamamoto heard the sound escape his own throat before he could stop it, a strangled gasp that bordered on a sob. Around him, his men, hardened veterans of campaigns in Manchuria and China, men who had witnessed and committed acts that would haunt them into whatever afterlife awaited, stood frozen. One soldier, Private Kenji Sato, a 22-year-old farmhand from Hokkaido, openly wept. Not from pity, from something far more destabilizing. From terror, because Captain Thomas Brennan, United States Army Medical Corps, serial number 016-74523, was supposed to be dead. The mathematics of his survival were impossible. The physics defied comprehension. Yet there he stood, silhouetted against the rising sun, an apparition of American resilience that would become, in that moment, more powerful than any weapon Yamamoto's division possessed. To understand why Japanese soldiers wept at the sight of a single American medic emerging from certain death, one must first understand what they had been taught about their enemy. The Imperial Japanese military indoctrination system of the early 1940s was comprehensive, pervasive, and built upon a foundation of racial and cultural superiority that permeated every level of military education. American soldiers, according to the training manuals distributed to every enlisted man and officer, were materialistic cowards. Soft men from a soft nation. They loved comfort more than honor. They feared death absolutely. Their industrial wealth had made them weak in spirit, disconnected from the warrior traditions that gave Japanese soldiers their strength, the Senjinkan. The Imperial Japanese Army's Field Service Code issued in January 1941 explicitly stated that Japanese soldiers must never surrender, must embrace death before dishonor, must view their lives as already belonging to the emperor. American forces, the instructors insisted, operated under no such spiritual discipline. When faced with genuine hardship, when stripped of their material advantages, they would collapse. Lieutenant Yamamoto had believed this completely. He had been educated at the Imperial Military Academy in Tokyo, had scored in the top 15% of his class in military theory and tactical assessment. He had studied the American campaigns in Europe through intelligence reports and capture documents. The Americans relied on overwhelming firepower, on industrial capacity, on the logistical ability to feed and supply their forces with luxuries unimaginable to Japanese soldiers subsisting on rice balls and seaweed. But remove those advantages, the doctrine insisted, and you would find hollow men beneath. The bombardment of the field hospital at Luzon had been designed to test that hypothesis in the most brutal terms imaginable. Remove the American capacity for comfort. Bury them in darkness and suffocation. Subject them to the absolute terror of slow death beneath tons of earth. See how their materialism serves them then. 72 hours earlier, Captain Thomas Brennan had been performing emergency surgery on a Filipino resistance fighter when the first shell struck. The field hospital, designated Medical Company C, 149th Infantry Regiment, had been operating in what American forces believed was a relatively secure position, set back 3 kilometers from the active front lines. The facility consisted of 4 large tents reinforced with bamboo framing, a triage station, a surgical theater equipped with 2 operating tables, and a recovery ward that held 23 wounded men that morning. Brennan was 31 years old. He had grown up in Duluth, Minnesota, the son of an iron or dock worker and a schoolteacher. He had attended the University of Minnesota on a partial scholarship, working nights as a janitor in the same medical school buildings where he studied during the day. His professors remembered him as competent but not exceptional, a solid B student who compensated for average academic performance with extraordinary work ethic and an uncommon capacity for remaining calm under pressure. He had been drafted in December 1942. He had completed medical officer training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, where his instructors noted in his evaluation, Lieutenant Brennan demonstrates adequate surgical technique and above-average decision-making capacity in emergency scenarios. Recommend for field assignment. There was nothing in his record to suggest he was exceptional, nothing to indicate he possessed any quality that would allow him to survive what came next. The first shell struck the surgical tent at 0612 hours on January 14th. Brennan was elbow deep in a thoracic cavity, attempting to repair a sucking chest wound, when the explosion lifted the entire structure 3 feet off the ground and dropped it sideways. The bamboo framing collapsed inward. Canvas and timber and surgical equipment cascaded down in a chaos of destruction that killed 4 men instantly. 3 patients and 1 surgical assistant, Lieutenant Peter Morrison of Cleveland, Ohio, who was crushed beneath a support beam that struck him across the temple. Brennan survived the initial collapse by pure chance. He had been standing in the precise location where 2 support beams intersected, creating a small, triangular pocket of space when the structure fell. The patient on his operating table, a 20-year-old Filipino named Carlos Mendoza, was protected by the same geometry. They found themselves in darkness, in a space roughly 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet high at its apex. A coffin with 2 living occupants. The bombardment continued for 17 minutes. Each subsequent impact caused the debris pile to settle, to compress, to squeeze that pocket of survival smaller. Dust filled the space so completely that breathing became a conscious act of will. Brennan could feel the weight increasing above him with each shell burst, could hear the timber groaning as the tons accumulated. He knew with absolute medical certainty that he was dying, that they were all dying, that the air was finite and the weight was infinite and no rescue would come because the Americans would not even attempt to reach this position until the bombardment ceased. And by then it would be far too late. He made a choice in that darkness that would define everything that followed. He continued the surgery. By touch alone, working in complete darkness with debris raining down and the pocket shrinking with each passing minute, Captain Thomas Brennan completed the thoracic repair he had started. He could not see the wound. He could barely breathe. His hands were slick with blood and dust. But he had been trained to trust his tactile sense, had spent hundreds of hours practicing sutures and anatomical identification with his eyes closed. And now, the training became the only thing standing between Carlos Mendoza and suffocation from his own blood. He stitched by memory. He applied pressure bandages by feel. He monitored the patient's pulse by pressing 2 fingers against the carotid artery, counting heartbeats in the dark, adjusting his technique based entirely on the rhythm he felt beneath his fingertips. The surgery took 42 minutes. When it was complete, Carlos Mendoza was breathing easier. His pulse was stronger. He would survive the wound. Whether he would survive the burial was another question entirely. In the Japanese command post 2 kilometers distant, Colonel Masao Watanabe reviewed the artillery reports with satisfaction. The bombardment had been textbook perfect. Forward observers confirmed complete destruction of the target area. Aerial reconnaissance. A single key, 43 Hayabusa fighter making a high-speed pass over the sector, reported no visible structures remaining, only a large debris field smoking gently in the tropical heat. The American hospital is eliminated. Watanabe informed his division commander via field telephone. We may proceed with the assault as scheduled. The division commander, Major General Takashi Yokoyama, expressed satisfaction. The Americans rely too heavily on their medical capacity, he observed. They cannot accept casualties the way we can. By destroying their ability to save their wounded, we destroy their will to fight. Proceed with the main attack at dawn. This strategic calculation was not unique to Yokoyama. Throughout the Pacific theater, Japanese commanders had come to recognize that American forces demonstrated an unusual, from the Japanese perspective, an almost pathological, unwillingness to abandon their wounded. American units would risk entire companies to evacuate single casualties. They would delay tactical withdrawals to retrieve bodies. They maintained elaborate medical evacuation chains that consumed vast resources. Aircraft, vehicles, personnel, supplies, all dedicated to the singular purpose of keeping wounded soldiers alive and returning them to combat effectiveness. From a purely rational military perspective, this made little sense to Japanese planners. A wounded soldier who required evacuation removed not only himself from the battlefield, but also the men who carried him, the medics who treated him, the doctors who operated on him, the logistics personnel who supplied the medical infrastructure. The Americans were, in effect, creating their own resource drain by refusing to accept the simple arithmetic of attrition. But there was a deeper truth beneath this observation, one that Japanese commanders failed to fully grasp until far too late in the war. The American commitment to medical care was not a weakness born of softness. It was a strategic asset born of ideology. American soldiers fought harder because they knew their nation would not abandon them. They took risks they might otherwise avoid because they trusted that if wounded, they would be saved. The medical infrastructure did not drain American combat effectiveness. It amplified it. A soldier who believes rescue is certain fights differently than a soldier who believes death is inevitable. Captain Thomas Brennan, buried alive beneath the ruins of Medical Company C, embodied this principle in its purest form. He was not thinking about strategic theory or ideological differences. He was thinking about breathing, about conserving oxygen, about keeping Carlos Mendoza calm because panic would accelerate oxygen consumption, about the 17 other men he could hear moving in the darkness around him, trapped in their own pockets of survival, calling out to each other in the dark with increasing desperation as the hours passed. The human body can survive approximately 3 days without water. In tropical heat, beneath tons of debris, with minimal air circulation and constant exertion, that timeline compresses dramatically. By the end of the first day, Brennan's tongue had swollen in his mouth. His lips had cracked and split. He could feel his kidneys beginning to shut down, could recognize the early symptoms of severe dehydration with the clinical detachment of his medical training. But he could also hear voices. Private First Class Daniel Kowalski, a machine gunner from Pittsburgh, was trapped somewhere to his left, calling out at regular intervals. Doc, you still there? Corporal James Washington, a supply clerk from Atlanta, was pinned under a beam somewhere behind him, his voice growing weaker with each hour but still present, still fighting. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, an Army Nurse Corps officer from San Francisco, was maintaining a running commentary on her own condition. Broken leg, possible internal bleeding, but conscious and coherent. Brennan appointed himself their lifeline. He could not dig. He could not escape. But he could talk. He could keep them focused. He could conduct medical assessments by voice, walking each trapped soldier through self-examination procedures, instructing them on how to apply pressure to wounds they could not see, how to position their bodies to maximize breathing efficiency in confined spaces, how to slow their heart rates through controlled breathing to conserve oxygen. Tell me about home, he called out into the darkness during the second night. Tell me what you're going to do when you get back. And they did. In the suffocating dark, with death pressing down from above, the trapped soldiers of Medical Company C told stories. Private Kowalski described the Polish bakery his family ran in Pittsburgh, the smell of fresh bread at 4 a.m, the way his mother would let him eat the broken Pyrgis that couldn't be sold. Corporal Washington spoke about his daughter, 3 years old when he shipped out, how he carried her photograph in his helmet and talked to it before every patrol. Lieutenant Chun described the medical practice she planned to open in San Francisco after the war, specializing in pediatrics, determined to make sure no child suffered the way she had seen children suffer in this conflict. Brennan listened to all of it. He memorized their stories with the same careful attention he had once used to memorize anatomical structures, because he understood something fundamental about survival that went beyond medical knowledge. Human beings can endure almost anything if they believe someone cares whether they live or die. This was the truth Lieutenant Yamamoto and his soldiers did not yet understand as they observed the bombardment site from their forward position. They had been taught that American individualism made soldiers weak, that the American focus on personal survival over collective sacrifice was a fatal flaw. But they had misunderstood the nature of American individualism entirely. It was not selfishness. It was mutual obligation. Each American soldier mattered because every American soldier mattered. The care extended to Thomas Brennan by the system that trained him, equipped him, and sent him to this jungle was the same care he now extended to every man and woman trapped in the darkness around him. On the morning of the third day, January 17th, at approximately 0420 hours, something shifted in the debris pile. A pocket of space that had been sealed for nearly 70 hours suddenly connected to the surface. Fresh air rushed in, thin, insufficient, but present. A sliver of gray pre-dawn light penetrated the darkness. Captain Brennan felt it on his face. Cool air. Movement. Possibility. He waited 30 minutes, listening carefully, assessing the structural stability of the debris pile by sound. Military doctrine was explicit. Never attempt to move in an unstable collapse until you understand the forces acting on the wreckage. A premature excavation attempt could cause a secondary collapse that would kill everyone still alive inside. But Brennan also understood that time was finite. He had already survived far longer than medical science suggested was possible. His body was in advanced stages of dehydration. His right leg was almost certainly fractured. He had felt the fibula crack during the initial collapse, had felt the grinding sensation of bone fragments with each subsequent shift in the debris. Several of the voices that had called out in the darkness had fallen silent. Private Kowalski had stopped responding 6 hours earlier. Corporal Washington's last transmission had been barely audible, a whispered request for Brennan to tell his daughter he loved her. Brennan made the calculation. If he waited for proper rescue, they would all die. If he attempted to dig, he might cause a collapse that would kill them all. But if he did nothing, death was certain. He chose action. The excavation took 3 hours and 17 minutes. Brennan moved debris by hand, one piece at a time, testing each movement, listening for the groan of settling weight that would indicate instability. He worked in complete silence. Every ounce of his remaining energy focused on the precise choreography of survival. He widened the air pocket. He reached Carlos Mendoza and dragged him toward the opening, moving the unconscious Filipino by inches, protecting the surgical site he had repaired 3 days earlier in the dark. He found Lieutenant Chun wedged beneath a collapsed section of the surgical tent. She was unconscious but breathing. He could not move her alone. The beam across her legs was too heavy, the angle too awkward. He made another choice. He would return for her. But first, he would get Carlos to the surface. He would establish that escape was possible. Then he would come back. It was this decision, this methodical prioritization of the achievable over the ideal, that Lieutenant Yamamoto witnessed when he raised his field glasses at 0547 hours. He did not see a miraculous resurrection. He saw an American officer performing a tactical calculation, executing a rescue operation with the same systematic precision Japanese commanders prided themselves on demonstrating. But what shattered Yamamoto's worldview was not the methodology. It was the fact that Brennan was doing it at all. A Japanese officer in the same situation, Yamamoto knew with absolute certainty, would have committed suicide by the end of the first day. The Senjinkan was explicit. Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving behind the crime of a stain on your name. To be trapped, to be helpless, to be unable to fight. This was the ultimate dishonor. The only acceptable response was death, preferably by one's own hand. But here was Captain Thomas Brennan, dragging himself out of a tomb after 3 days, legs shattered, body failing, still fighting not to kill but to save. He carried no weapon. He had committed no final act of defiant violence against the enemy. He had simply survived and then chosen to use that survival to rescue another human being. It was incomprehensible. It violated every principle of Bushido, every lesson of the imperial military system, and yet it was undeniably real. Private Sato, the young farmhand from Hokkaido, lowered his rifle. His hand was shaking too badly to aim. "He should be dead," Sato whispered in Japanese. "Why is he not dead?" Yamamoto had no answer. He watched as Brennan laid the young Filipino girl gently on the ground, checked her pulse with movements so automatic they seemed reflexive, and then turned back toward the debris pile. The American was going back into the darkness, back into the tomb. "He's going to dig out the others," Yamamoto said softly, though no one had asked. "He's going to try to save them all." Around him, his soldiers watched in silence as Captain Thomas Brennan disappeared back into the rubble. They watched as he emerged, 90 minutes later, supporting Lieutenant Sarah Chun, her broken leg splinted with pieces of shattered bamboo and surgical tape. They watched as he went back a third time and pulled out the body of Private First Class Daniel Kowalski, dead for many hours but carried to the surface with the same care Brennan had shown the living. The Japanese assault schedule for that dawn never materialized. Colonel Watanabe, observing the same scene through his own field glasses from the command post, made a decision that would cost him his command but save what remained of his conscience. He delayed the attack. He withdrew his forward positions. He allowed American rescue teams to reach the site uncontested. In his official report, Watanabe cited unexpected enemy reinforcements and unfavorable tactical conditions. In his private journal, discovered decades later in a Tokyo archive, he wrote something different. "We cannot defeat an enemy whose medics fight harder to save lives than our soldiers fight to take them. We are fighting the wrong war with the wrong understanding." The final count from the collapsed field hospital was 12 dead and 11 survivors. Captain Thomas Brennan personally evacuated 7 of those 11. He remained conscious long enough to brief the arriving rescue team on the condition of each patient, on the medical interventions he had performed in the darkness, on the supplies he had been able to salvage from the wreckage. Then he collapsed. He was evacuated to a field hospital in Manila, then to a general hospital in Australia, then eventually to Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. His right leg was amputated below the knee due to complications from the compound fracture and 3 days of untreated infection. He received the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House in September 1945. President Harry S. Truman placed the medal around his neck and said, "Captain, you have shown the world what American medicine is capable of. But more importantly, you've shown them what American character is made of." Brennan's response, recorded in the official transcript, was characteristically modest. "I was just doing my job, sir." Any doctor would have done the same. But this was not true, and Brennan knew it. Any competent doctor could have performed surgery in the dark. Any determined individual might have survived the burial through sheer willpower. What separated Brennan's actions from mere survival was the choice he made in that first moment of darkness when the debris collapsed. The choice to continue serving others even when self-preservation would have been not just understandable, but medically rational. This choice was not individual. It was cultural. It emerged from a society that valued individual life so highly that it had built an entire military medical infrastructure around the principle that no soldier should die for lack of care. The Americans had deployed more medical personnel per combat soldier than any military in history. They had established elaborate evacuation chains. They had pioneered new surgical techniques specifically designed for battlefield conditions. They had even developed a system of blood banks, refrigerated whole blood transported from the United States to frontline surgical units that allowed for immediate transfusions under fire. To Japanese military planners, this seemed like wasteful overinvestment. To American doctors like Thomas Brennan, it was the baseline expectation of a civilized nation at war. The symbolic object that recurred throughout Brennan's story, the element that Japanese soldiers found most incomprehensible, was the prosthetic leg he was fitted with at Walter Reed. It was a sophisticated device, far more advanced than anything available to Japanese wounded. It featured a mechanical knee joint, an articulated ankle, and a padded socket designed for maximum comfort during extended use. The prosthetic was custom fitted through multiple appointments, adjusted and readjusted until it allowed Brennan to walk without a cane, to return to practicing medicine, to live a full life despite his injury. Lieutenant Yamamoto, who survived the war and spent 2 years in an American POW camp in the Philippines, witnessed American wounded receiving similar prosthetics during his captivity. He watched American doctors fit a young Marine who had lost both legs at Iwo Jima with articulated prosthetics that allowed him to walk, to dance, to eventually return to his hometown and marry his high school sweetheart. Yamamoto compared this to the fate of Japanese soldiers who lost limbs, sent home with crude wooden pegs or simple crutches, often to a society that viewed their survival as shameful evidence that they had not fought hard enough to die honorably. In his post-war memoir, published in Japanese in 1963, Yamamoto wrote, "We were taught that Americans were soft because they valued comfort. We failed to understand that their comfort was not weakness, but civilization. They built prosthetics because they believed disabled soldiers deserved to walk. They evacuated wounded under fire because they believed every life had value. They fed prisoners well because they believed even enemies were human. We mistook all of this for weakness when it was, in fact, their greatest strength. They fought not to die gloriously, but to live fully. And that made them unbeatable." The story of Captain Thomas Brennan became legendary within American military medical circles, but remained relatively unknown to the broader public for decades. Brennan himself resisted publicity. He returned to Minnesota after the war, completed his surgical residency, and opened a small practice in Duluth specializing in trauma surgery. He treated factory workers injured in industrial accidents, car crash victims, hunting mishaps, the unglamorous bread and butter of civilian emergency medicine. But once a year, on January 17th, he received visitors. They came from across the country, these aging men and women who had been buried with him in the darkness of Luzon. They came to remember Private Kowalski, who did not survive. They came to celebrate Lieutenant Shun, who became a pioneering pediatrician in San Francisco. They came to check on Carlos Mendoza, who had immigrated to the United States in 1952 and became a high school teacher in Los Angeles, who named his first son Thomas, who told every student about the American doctor who had performed surgery on him in complete darkness. And they came to remind each other of a truth that the Japanese soldiers had wept to witness, that the American way of war was not, at its core, about superior firepower or industrial capacity or material abundance. It was about the radical proposition that every individual life possessed infinite value, and that a society organized around that principle could produce ordinary men and women capable of extraordinary acts. Captain Thomas Brennan died in 1987 at the age of 73. His funeral was attended by more than 400 people, including 3 survivors from the Luzon collapse, 2 doctors he had trained during his long career, and 1 very old Japanese man who stood at the back of the church and wept silently through the entire service. No one asked Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto why he had traveled from Tokyo to Duluth to attend the funeral of an enemy medic. No one questioned his right to be there. And when the service concluded, Yamamoto approached Brennan's widow and said, in careful English, "Your husband taught me that courage is not the willingness to die. It is the determination to ensure others may live. I have tried to honor that lesson." She took his hands in hers and said simply, "Thank you for coming." This exchange, this quiet moment of recognition between former enemies, was the truest epilogue to the story. Because what terrified those Japanese soldiers on that January morning in 1945 was not American firepower or industrial might. It was the realization that they were fighting a nation that valued life so profoundly that even its medics refused to accept death, that built systems and institutions around the preservation of the individual, that taught its soldiers not to die gloriously, but to live purposefully. The debris of Medical Company C still lies somewhere in the Luzon jungle, overgrown with vegetation, gradually being reclaimed by the earth. But the lesson of that collapse, that a free society's greatest strength lies not in its capacity for destruction, but in its commitment to preservation, echoes forward through generations. It lives in every military medic who runs toward danger rather than away from it. It lives in every prosthetic fitted to a wounded veteran. It lives in every civilian emergency room where doctors work through the night to save lives they will never know. Captain Thomas Brennan walked out of that tomb, not because he was superhuman, but because he was profoundly human, shaped by a culture that insisted human life was precious beyond calculation. The Japanese soldiers wept because they recognized in that moment that they were fighting not just an army, but an idea. The idea that no one should die alone, that every life deserves rescue, that the true measure of civilization is not how gloriously its warriors die, but how desperately its healers fight to keep them alive. That idea, more than any weapon, won the war. And it continues to stand, a monument more enduring than any stone memorial, in the simple truth that on a jungle hillside 80 years ago, one American doctor chose to save lives instead of accepting death, and in doing so, revealed the deepest strength of the nation that had sent him there.